Well, to get some analysis of the situation in Spain, we're joined by John Blaxland, Professor in International Security and Intelligence Studies at the ANU. John Blaxland, welcome.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on the program.
Let's look at this attack in Barcelona, the first one that occurred. Initially, it looked as though it may have been a lone wolf attack with one or two individuals involved. It's now clear that it involved as many as, or perhaps at least, 8 suspects.
Yes.
How alarming would this be for intelligence agencies?
Yeah, I think for Spain this is a particularly disconcerting development. They have had a pretty long period now, 13 years of benign situation ever since the 2004 Al-Qaeda attack on the train line in Madrid, which killed nearly 200 people and injured about 2,000. That's now quite a long time ago, and of course Spain has wound back its presence in the Middle East in terms of supporting the coalition against radical jihadist groups there, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, although they still do have a presence in Iraq. So what we're seeing, though, is a group that was plotting to use propane, butane in an apparent attempt to make a big type of truck bomb. That's failed, and they've launched this attack as a fallback. Thankfully, they weren't clever enough to get it all together. Had they been clever enough to get it all together, it would have been far more devastating potentially than this one. But what we're seeing here, apparently, is this manifestation of a kind of build it, do it DIY, do it yourself, build it yourself type of terrorism. That is a manifestation of a self-spawning groups in places like we're seeing in Barcelona that are emulating the experience of others in other parts of Europe and around the world. And this is particularly troubling, very difficult for intelligence agencies to get on top of, particularly if you've got a family group or a very close circle who don't need to communicate electronically, who aren't emanating and aren't therefore being subject to being monitored by the intelligence agencies closely. This really does mean there's a need for a fresh thinking about how you respond to situations like this. Now, we have spent a fortune over the years, we, the West, many countries, Spain included, in trying to ratchet up our criminal prosecution, and that seems to be working pretty well. Our intelligence collection, our ability to understand the situation better, in network internationally, and yet we're still seeing this kind of incident happen. So there's a couple of things I think that spring out of this. One is that the countering violent extremism programs that countries have, Australia's got a CVE program, many countries do, really do need to get ratcheted up. There's more effort needs to be put into, in effect, a kind of neighbourhood watch kind of program, but on steroids, if you like. One that is looking to communicate effectively to the people, that is actually looking to more effectively get information from the community, and also doing more in terms of education and reaching out to communities to try and provide a counter message that's not from the government. It's nothing worse than announced from the Australian government a message against jihadism. What we need is a message that comes from Australians, from the community, particularly from within and through the migrant and Muslim communities in Australia, to actually address this. It's a real challenge.
How worrying is it that they were able to carry out this attack using a vehicle, which we've seen in the past, of course. But as you mentioned, it appears as though their initial plan was to carry out a bombing, and that was foiled, so they quickly arranged this plan B.
Well, that's right. And I think what we're going to see is probably there's a need for us to think a bit harder about how we check on people who rent vehicles. Who use vehicles. I mean, it's only one mechanism. I get it. It's like trying to do more at the airport. You're not going to stop it necessarily, but you're presenting another obstacle, making it more difficult for would-be terrorists to go down that path. Essentially, the ability to hire trucks and use them either as a bomb or as a weapon itself, like a cannonball down an alley, really does need that kind of checking. But the other thing, and we've seen this in Australia already, and I do think it's rudimentary and it's not the whole solution, but it is part of the solution. and that's more bollards. Bollards do actually stop vehicles. They actually make it very hard for a vehicle like that to rumble down. And we saw that in London and Westminster. No bollards on the bridges, basically very easy to get up and down off the gutters and do whatever they like in a public space where there are a lot of people. So, you know, there's a few measures there, but interestingly enough, Andrew, it's worth reflecting here. You know, when we think about, in Australia's context, we spend a lot of money on the intelligence and security aspects of countering violent extremism, countering terrorism. And that's completely warranted. I'm not at all taking away from that. But we do need to really ratchet up the programs that are about focusing on the community, on countering violent extremism, nipping it in the bud, and getting in there to actually diffuse and really suck the oxygen out of the circumstances where these kind of lonesome losers bubble up to the surface, wanting to make themselves look great, you know, on some kind of deranged sense of perspective about what they think is going to get them, you know, a place in heaven. We really need to think creatively, and we need to throw more resources at this as a nation, at the local level, at the state, at the federal. This is a big challenge. Spain's facing it, but we should be thinking about the implications for Australia. We're very fortunate in Australia. We have a far less of a challenge in this sense than a lot of the European countries, but we can't be complacent. We really do need to be proactive.
The threat posed to Spain has been ever present in the past few years, coming from Morocco across the Mediterranean there, which is regarded, certainly the north, you know, on the coast of Morocco, seen as essentially a hotbed of extremism. And now a number of these suspects are believed to have been from Morocco. So
yes.
Clearly that is a big problem that Spain must address. Has it been a failure of intelligence to a point that they haven't managed to get on top of that completely?
Well, look, it's a very complicated picture. Intelligence is certainly part of it, and inadequate intelligence in this particular instance certainly has contributed. But Spain, like much of southern Europe and the whole of the European continent, faces a real existential challenge with managing its borders, with managing the flow of people from North Africa across the Mediterranean, into Spain, into Italy, into Greece, and through there into the rest of Europe. In an uncontrolled manner, this is presenting security authorities with enormous challenges. This is, you know, we in Australia don't face anything remotely on this scale. So while you might, you know, it's easy to say, oh, it's an intelligence failure. Okay, on one level, yes, but the scale of the challenge is enormous. And let's not forget, this is the land of Al-Andalus, the former where the Moors, you know, interesting, the word the Moors, it's one that is actually reflected at the other end of what was the Spanish Empire, the Moro people, the Moro Islamic liberation space in Mindanao. So there is a story here about this sense of Islamic identity that is permeating this extremist behaviour, which I recognise is not what the most of you know, law-abiding Muslims are into it all, but there is a toxic dimension on the edges here that we in Australia, the people in Spain, in the Philippines, around the world actually need to be thinking much more creatively about how to counter the message and really diffuse the situation.
And John, just briefly, Spain is a member of the US global coalition fighting Islamic State group. What is the aim, or what would have been the aim of these terrorists? Is it to convince the Spanish government to withdraw from that coalition?
Well, that's certainly what the intention was for the Al-Qaeda mission back in 2004 that saw so many people injured 13 years ago. We haven't seen an announcement from Daesh or the Islamic State group. I think the point here is that, you know, the Daesh or IS group will put the label on it as they will. They will call it what they want because they're looking, you know, they're under so much pressure in the remnants of their forces in Iraq and Syria. They're looking for anything to give them kind of a bit of a morale boost and to fan the flames, if you like, and give people hope within the jihadist movement that the caliphate will be perpetuated. So we don't know for sure, but I imagine that the Daesh or IS group people will be looking to capitalise in this and make more of it. But what is interesting is we don't see this time around the kind of pre-recorded suicide notes from anybody involved. So my sense is that this is much more ad hoc, much more a local manifestation that's kind of just sprouted in Barcelona, in and around Barcelona.
Professor John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU, thanks very much.
My pleasure, Andrew.